being in Daniel's position. And, wow. You know, it's easy for us to look back and now there are things in here we don't understand or we try to understand, but there are some things that fortunately God has clearly explained to us, and a portion of chapter 8 is like that. And then there is a middle section of chapter 8 that is verses 9 through 14 that are really interesting. And so here's how we're going to work Daniel chapter 8. We're going to look at verses 1 through 8 and most likely verses 15 through 22 tonight, because that's the interpretation of the dream. And then next week, next Wednesday, we're going to come back and we're going to look at Daniel chapter 8 verses 9 through 14. And here's why. And I'll just say it in the front. In verse 13 and 14, there is a time element, which is really important. And the time element is something that can be challenging and difficult to understand, or it can be controversial. But it's 2,300 days, right? And other places we read about 1,290 days. And so we need to try to determine what that means. That's going to take a whole lesson to do that. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to look at some history. And our history begins in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. So we are, if you remember back to chapter 7, when did Daniel have his first dream? In what year of Belshazzar's reign? In the first year. Now we're in the 3rd year of his reign, and so we're 2 years later. Imagine, if you will, you've had this dream in chapter 7, and we talked a lot about that dream. We took about 3 lessons to talk through that, and there's some very interesting things in there. And now 2 years later, it says in verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ulai. All right, so here is the Babylonian Empire, okay? And here is Babylon. Here is Susa, which is, I will show you, is also Shushan. All right, and the distance between Babylon and Susa on this map, or Shushan in Daniel, is about 200 miles. This is the Babylonian Empire, roughly speaking. Here is the Medo-Persian Empire, okay, and same thing, Susa here, and then we'll move on from there. Let me share some interesting information with you because, and I said this is going to be more historical, right? This lesson, I know it's like, oh, history. It is going to be some history. So Belshazzar reigned somewhere. It's hard to pinpoint when he started, but we can definitely pinpoint when his reign ended, and that is in 539 BC. And in 539 BC, the Medo-Persians came in, and we're going to read about that, and they captured Babylon basically without a fight. Okay, and we find that Daniel is in Babylon right now. He is in Babylon. That's where he's at currently. So if we go back, he's here, and he has a dream or a vision, and that vision he is transported to here. All right? So he is transported, as it says, in his... You ever had a dream where you find yourself in another place? Well, that's what Daniel was having. Okay? He had a dream, and he was in the palace. And it's interesting because when you look at this idea here, Shushan became the central location for all of the Medo-Persian rulers. As a matter of fact, I did a little bit of research here. This is the Persian Empire. I'm going to come back to this. But the place where, so there is an actual archaeological excavation of the area in Shushan where Daniel had his dream. Right? This is a drawing of that. This is the actual. These are the actual ruins of Shushan, the palace where Darius and where Cyrus and all the others built their palaces. Matter of fact, if you go back here, does this name seem familiar? Artaxerxes. Who is he?
The second in between.
No, remember
That was different. Okay.
we're in Iran now. We're in Persia. Isn't Artaxerxes who Esther had to appear before? Right? Yeah. So I mean, so this kind of, I'm trying to bring some parallels in here. So this is actually in place. This is a drawing. They said this was about 300 acres square, what they have already excavated. The area in and of itself, they said, I have some notes here. It was about, if I can remember correctly, well, I think they said it's about, about 6 or 7 miles. The circumference of the city was about 6, this area was about 6 or 7 miles. They've excavated about 300 acres of it so far. So it's kind of cool. You can go out and you got to do a little bit of searching. Most of that excavation was done in about 1940. There were some really old pictures from the 40s on there. I thought those were, I didn't put them in here just for the sake of time, but thought this was interesting. That hill, if I remember correctly, that hill right there is called the Hill of Solomon. I don't know why. I couldn't find all that information. But they said that there is a hill there called the Hill of Solomon. But remember what happened with Daniel. Where did Daniel go when the Babylonians were captured or overtaken by the Medo-Persians? Did he not go into the government of the Medo-Persians? Yes, he did. He absolutely did. Remember, when Daniel went into the lion's den, right? Who was on the throne? Darius, the Persian, was on the throne. And they did not like Daniel because he had favor with Darius, and yet they used a trumped up charge of praying 3 times a day against him. So you have to kind of correlate all that, right? Who was it that allowed the Israelites to go back to the land of promise? It were the Persians, right? They were the ones. Matter of fact, we'll look at a few verses there. But so what we see, so Daniel is in Babylon in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, and he has a dream, and he's transported into the palace, which is in Shushan, which is in the province of Elam, which is in modern day Iran today. So again, think about this. We have Iraq, which is Babylon. We have Iran, which is Persia. And these are they have been so prominent throughout history, even through the times of the Bible. And he says, I was by the river. So we go back to this map here. You can see Shushan is here. There's I believe that they said there are 2 rivers that kind of parallel Shushan. This only shows one major one, but there are 2. That doesn't show it. There are 2 major rivers there in Shushan. So, and then he says, while in this vision, and with that, then I lifted, in verse 3, then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. Now, all right, so I've got a ram with 2 horns. That doesn't seem very unusual, right? I mean, don't rams have horns? I'm a Rams fan. Let me tell you, they have 2 horns, especially when they play really good football. They have 2 horns. But here, there is a significance to this. This ram had 2 horns. So what do we know about the Persian Empire? By the way, this is exactly where I got this drawings from. I don't try to hide that stuff. I didn't make this. I stole it off the internet. It's not licensed, so I'm okay. Bible History Online is where I got it. What do we know about the Persian Empire? Anybody? So it's made up of two dominant people, right? You had the Medes, which are up here, and then you had the Persians, which are down here, and they combined forces, and that's what, as we will see, as a matter of fact, I told you we're going to cover verses 15 through 22 as well. Look at verse 20 of Daniel chapter 9. Chapter 8, Here's an occasion where the scriptures clearly interpret what this is. The ram which you saw, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. So, the 2 horns are the kings of Mede and Persia, combined forces. That's what it says there. But one was higher than the other. So what's interesting about this is that there's no question about the design, because in Daniel 8:20 it tells us that it is denoted that the 2 kings are the kings of Mede and Persia. The united power of the kingdom was denoted by a ram itself. So what is our symbol of America from an animal perspective?
Eagle.
The bald eagle. Well, for the Persians it was the ram. So that's interesting. And the Medo side of that was an older power. As a matter of fact, it goes all the way back to the Assyrians. Remember the Assyrians? What is when you think of Assyria, what's the one thing that jumps out at you? The one thing that jumps out at me was that it was the Assyrians who destroyed the 10 northern tribes. So it was the Assyrians who did that. Okay, so that's part. But the Persians became the most mighty in their. Matter of fact, rarely do you hear about the Medo-Persian Empire, although you will see it in a lot of historical writings. Usually, it's just referred to as the Persian Empire, and that's what Daniel saw in this dream. Both were high. So when we read this idea that their horns were high, that denotes powerful. Okay? That denotes power there. But one horn was higher, and that means that one was more powerful than the other one. Okay? And we already know what they represent because the Lord revealed it to us in verse 20. And it says in verse 4, "And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great." So, what direction is missing from verse 4?
East.
East. Why did he not push eastward? Because he already controlled it. This is the Medes, this is the Persians. He pushed north, he pushed west, and he pushed south. And it basically, and what's interesting, Sister Kathy, will you turn over to Isaiah 46 and 11? It's interesting because not only do we find the prophecy here in Daniel chapter 8, but we also find it in the book of Isaiah chapter 46.
And 11?
Yeah, Isaiah 46:11.
Calling a ravenous bird from the east, the man that executeth my counsel from a far country. Yea, I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it, I will also do it.
Yeah. That verse, the ravenous bird from the east, is representative of Cyrus, who came from the east and pushed here. So remember, if you go back in history, we go back into the time of Isaiah's prophecy and Jeremiah's prophecy. They clearly foretold that Nebuchadnezzar would come. He was named, right? Nebuchadnezzar was named before he ever came, that he would conquer them. Do you remember how long they were in captivity in Babylon? their total term of time when they went and when they were not under that punishment anymore was how many years?
So it's 70?
70 years. That's correct. From Nebuchadnezzar to the end of Belshazzar, 70 years. And that's how long the Babylonian Empire ruled. And Isaiah said, God says through the prophet Isaiah, that he's going to send a ravenous bird from the east. And in verse 4, it tells us that this ram is pushing westward and northward and southward, and it denotes the conquest of this kingdom as it pushes in that direction. We find that as you look at this empire, on the west it conquered, and this are just some notes I pulled up, Babylon, Mesopotamia, Syria, Asia Minor. To the north, you've got Armenia, Iberia, and the regions around the Caspian Sea, and on the south, Palestine, Ethiopia, Egypt, Libya. And that's what we see here, right? So here's the Caspian Sea. So these countries here, we have the west, north, and then south, right? And that's what that denotes. So we think, okay, well, that's pretty easy for us to understand. And I agree, that's pretty easy. The Bible lays it out, it tells us. But imagine being Daniel, right? What if I told you that within 5 years, and I don't know, I tried to pin down how long Belshazzar was a ruler, so that I could tell you how long after this dream that these events happened. History doesn't quite tell us. There's a lot of telling my wife, there's so much information out there. I read one site that said that Belshazzar, the story of Belshazzar and them drinking out of the cups and then the writing on the wall was a story of fiction. I'm like, oh, okay. See, they want to discredit Daniel, and they want to discredit the book, and they want to discredit the Bible. And so we have to be careful. So it was really hard to pin down. I will say that that Belshazzar seems to be a kind of a placement, because the gentleman who actually ruled was in hiding for 10 years. So he created a coup against evil Mordecai and was in hiding for 10 years, and so therefore Belshazzar sat on the throne. That seems to be well received, but again, I don't want to bore the details. The Bible says Belshazzar sat on the throne. He is. How long he sat there, it's hard to say. What I will say though is, if I stood up before you and I said, I've had a dream, and in that dream 5 years from now, X country is going to rise to power and we are not going to exist anymore, you'd think I was crazy. No, you wouldn't think I was crazy?
Well, I think as Americans, we've had a pretty good run. to be relatively undisturbed.
Yeah, but imagine if God gave you that vision that says in 5 years, Brazil is going to rise up and is going to conquer everything in South America and North America, and we are all going to be under Brazilian rule. So did they know about the Medo-Persians? Probably, because, again, they're their neighbors, and people travel back and forth. But remember that Babylon was pretty secure as the world dominant power at that time. And here God is saying, not only is he saying that he's given you this vision of a ram with 2 horns, but one is greater than the other, then Gabriel, the angel, comes along in verse 15 and says, I'm going to explain to you what this is, and that's the Medo-Persian Empire, and they're going to push westward, they're going to dominate over Babylon. And he's like, he said, I'm not sure he ever got over the dream in Daniel chapter 7, right? And now here he is giving that. He's given them the same information. Remember that if we go back to Daniel chapter 7, he tells us about these beasts, but he never names the beasts. In Daniel chapter 8, he's given them slightly different color. Instead of calling them beasts, he calls one a ram. He's going to call the next one a he-goat, right? Or a goat. And we're going to find that this goat represents somebody as well. Matter of fact, I'm going to tell you right now, it represents a country, It represents a kingdom that they had never even heard of. Think about that. They didn't know who Greece was. They didn't know who that was. And so God is revealing these things to Daniel, and he's doing so for a reason, and we'll see what that is later on. All right, so we have this realm. So we have the Medo-Persian Empire, and they're pushing northward and westward and southward. Got it. All right. Nothing could stop them. Nothing could stand in their way. Then we get to verse 5. And as I was considering, so here's Daniel in this vision, sleeping, and I can just see him. He's having this vision while he's in his trance or sleep or whatever. He's like, thinking about that. Medo-Persians. Okay. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And so what we have here, let me just read down through verse 7. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, before the river, and ran unto him in a fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable horns, or 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. All right. This he-goat that we see in verse 5. So I want you to think of a flying unicorn. That's what he describes, right? He describes a flying unicorn. All right, well, I know that's kind of a super unicorn goat that can fly. That's crazy. All right, now, he says, as I was looking on this vision, as I was pondering this vision, certainly it was one that would naturally attract attention. We find that he is given another scene, right? And the whole scene here is future, because the Medo-Persian power was not yet, but yet we find it's coming in. And what happens is, he has this dream about the Greek Empire. And the Greek Empire is based right here in Greece. Pella was their throne. And so when we see that he-goat moves, which way does the he-goat move? East. He comes this way, right? He comes from the west, and he moves east. It says here, he's on the face of the whole earth. He seems to move over the whole world. Now, again, it's one of those things where when you see that, the idea that he moved over the whole world, right? I think we have to understand that this is still a regional issue, right? Because even though, when we look at the Greek Empire, does anybody know how far east Alexander the Great pushed? What was the furthest east that he went? I'll tell you, he went all the way to India. It's a long ways. But he didn't go far. He didn't go very far to the west, because here's Rome. And then we have over here Spain. And we have up here Britannia. And we have up here the Germans. I forget what they were called. They had a name. They're in existence. They're all descendants from Noah, right? They're there. So he didn't conquer the whole world, but this was the regional focus of the Old Testament. So remember, sometimes when we read this term of the whole world, it's the whole world, like Noah's, the flood, right? Covered the face of the whole earth. And then sometimes we read it, it's the known world, or the focus of that statement. We have to use the language and the knowledge that we have to try to identify that. And he touched not the ground. It means that he seems to bound along as if he did not. So let me share some information about Alexander the Great. I told you it's going to be a history lesson. So we had the Medo-Persians. By the way, one of the things that the Medo-Persians tried to do, to go back here, is if you look at their border here, what's the one area that they didn't actually ever quite conquer? Greece. But I'm going to tell you, if you go back and you study history, they tried, and they tried, and they tried, and they tried. And one of the things that I read, and this was from Barnes' commentary, and he said that one of the reasons why he moved so fast when Alexander the Great came into power, that one of the reasons why he moved so fast was because he had a hatred for the Persians. Because they kept trying, they actually had a peace agreement and they kept invading him, right? So Alexander the Great, let me just give you some more information on him about this. He came to power when he was 21, and he died at the age of 32, 33, just depends on who you read about. So roughly 11, 12 years. And in those 11, 12 years, he did some pretty incredible things. Let me just give you some example. In the year 334 BC, he invaded Persia. He defeated the Persians in the Battle of Granchius. And in the year 333, he again defeated them at the Battle of Issus and conquered Parthia and some other in Asia Minor. In 332, he conquered Tyre and Egypt and built Alexandria. And if you know anything about ancient history, and again, I'm no expert, but they say that in Alexandria was the world's greatest library. In that library, they gathered up all of the ancient text writings, Hippolytus, and so many others. And this was the greatest library known in the world. In the year 331, he defeated Darius Commodus, and in 330, he completed the conquest of the Persian Empire. In 328, he defeated the king of India and persuaded and pushed his march to the Ganges River. So in these few years, he had overrun nearly all the known world. It was just an incredible. He never stopped fighting. And then he died. Notice the language that we see here. In verse 7. And I saw him come close unto the ram. So the ram is... Who's the ram? Persia. Alexander the Great. How do we know this is Alexander the Great? Well, because verse 21 says in Daniel 8, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia. Now I'm going to come back to that word Grecia in a minute. But we will accept that. All right? But they didn't know who the Greeks were at the time. It's a Hebrew word called Javan, and we'll come back to that, okay? But, so, the goat came close unto the ram, Persia. Alexander the Great came to the ram, and he was moved with choler, which is anger. I mean, it is just wrath. It is flaming eyes anger. He hated the Persians, and he smote the ram. He brake his two horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. The Persians didn't have a prayer. God is telling Daniel future history of the greatest empires of the known world before in the BC area, and their rise and their downfall. And it says, and he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him. He not just cast him to the ground, but he stomped on him. He trampled him. He crushed him into the ground. He was not going to leave any doubt of what he was doing. And there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. There was no army. There was no nation. There was no other kingdom that could come and help the Persians against Alexander the Great. And it says in verse 8, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, they were aged 32/33, the great horn was broken. He lost his power. He died. It's done. That's what that verse says. the horn that breaks is the horn of the goat. And for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. So, thanks, man. Oh, by the way, so I took this is just a snippet. This is a Bible program that I use to help me understand language. I went into, right here, I went into verse 21. Here's how I do it. I pull up my Bible program, I go to the verse, I pull up, this is a King James version with Strong's indexing. I click on this, the Hebrew word for Grisha, and it brings up the Strong's Hebrew dictionary, and it's the word Yavan. Okay? Basically, it's Javan, the name of the son of Joktan. By extension, though, now we say the Greeks, because we know looking back that that's who it is. But when Gabriel spoke this to Daniel, he said the he-goat is Javan. They didn't know who that was. They didn't know it. So that's the thing. I want to try to just help you to wrap your arms and your mind around this, that God is telling Daniel things that are going to happen with nations that they had never even heard of before, right? Had never even heard of them. All right, so go ahead.
Oh, well, I've got like 2 thoughts.
Okay.
First is that when it says that it's hot and active, and so what I was kind of thinking there was that Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Esther, that's Artaxerxes is one of Xerxes' 3 sons, and Xerxes leads the Persians against the Greeks at Thermopylae, which is the Hot Gates in 480 BC. And then the other thing I was thinking is that Daniel is thinking about something. He said like 5 years with the Medes, right? Like from the Medes,
I don't know.
Right, but something like that.
Yeah.
But then when he's talking to Alexander the Great, he's talking about 200 years later.
Yeah.
I mean, like that he's envisioning something that's not like it's not happening. Bam, bam, bam. He's seeing something, and then he's going to see something again. That's the timeline is just so far ahead.
Imagine being. So let me give you some reference. That's an excellent point. I want to give you credit for that. Imagine being in the 16th century, somewhere in the 1500s, and you get a vision that this great country from the West is going to rise up. And now here we are, America, right? Think about that. That's exactly what, because Alexander the Great's kingdom was, by any measure, correct me if I'm wrong, but it wasn't Napoleon that in his conquest, Napoleon was trying to recreate Alexander the Great's kingdom.
Oh yeah.
That's what all. Look, there's a reason why he's known as Alexander the Great. They don't call him Napoleon the Great, although he kind of lost some things. But there have been other great conquerors. Caesar in the Roman Empire, there were some great conquerors there. They weren't known. Alexander was known throughout the whole world as Alexander the Great for a reason. Here God is telling him about this man. They don't even know who he is. But what happens is he dies. And he dies at the age of 32 or 33. And when he dies, and I stole this slide, and there's some things I'm going to slightly disagree, and I'll call it out here in a minute. But one thing that I thought this was the best representation I could find of what actually happened. When Alexander the Great dies, he has a son. He has a 1-year-old son. He's not old enough to rule. And so they determine that they're going to have, what's the term that I'm looking for? Somebody to represent the kingdom on his behalf.
A proxy?
I'm sorry?
A proxy?
There's a royal term for it, and I apologize, I can't remember it. And that they choose his mother, but she's not very strong. And so what happens is essentially there are 4. It divides into 4. So that, by all accounts, it divides into 4. Now, I pulled down some books off online that I found. You want to talk about intertwining. When Alexander the Great died, his kingdom actually broke into 27 different provinces. But eventually they were basically consolidated under 4 families. And you know, you want to talk about some interesting names and some different. So let me give you. Most people would say that there's the Ptolemies, the Cassanders, the Seleucus, and the Licinius. Now, all right. So this says it's slightly different. Let me just point out the two most important ones. All right. The Ptolemies. The Ptolemy family essentially ruled the south. Egypt, Libya. Can anybody besides Matt tell me who probably the most famous person out of that dynasty is? When I tell you the name, you're going to know it. Huh?
Cleopatra.
Yes, Cleopatra. Cleopatra was from the Ptolemy group. The Seleucids basically took over here, and that was, anybody know who came out of that one? So my understanding is, descendant-wise, even though by the time it happened, that Rome was in charge, Mark Antony came out of that group. That's my understanding. But by the time that the Roman Empire was flourishing, we know that there was a lot of things happening. The person that I would tell you I know came out of that is a gentleman by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And in the Catholic Bible, we have the middle section between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Anybody know what that's called? The silence, the 400 years of silence. It's
Dark Ages.
no, it's called the Apocryphalia.
Yeah.
And the Apocryphalia is all about the Maccabees. Okay? Now, this is not gospel. I'm not telling you, this is just history. This is as much true probably as what I've told you about Antioch and about them. But the Maccabees were those that lived in the land of promise when the Seleucids reigned here. And you can read a lot about it in Josephus and other places. The Maccabean Wars. What I will tell you is that these men fought all the time. Matter of fact, there was a gentleman over here called he's got a cool name. Let me find it here. I'm so sorry. I thought I had it written down, but I don't. One of the generals who fought a lot and eventually lost, made alliances and lost, was known as, I think it was Antipater the One-Eye. So anyway, what's important to note is that Alexander the Great, a single horn, dies, and his kingdom is broken up into 4 different regions. And the Bible says that the 4 were never as strong as the one. So these guys fought. There were 4 major battles, and it was the battle of the Diadochi. It's a word that means the battle of the successors. And there was 4 different battles, and you can look that up. And it's basically there's basically 4 families, and they're all fighting for ultimate control. Now, what's important, you can forget about these 2 for just a second. What's important, and I'm going to give you a preview, and I've got to stop pointing with that and use my. In the Bible, we're going to read about the king of the north. We're going to read about the king of the south. And that's what we're referring to. The Seleucids here, and the Ptolemies down here. Okay? So when we get to some of those spots, I want you to remember this. And again, I said this is not accurate, but to me it depicted it the best. It was, and here's the thing about this: when Alexander the Great died, and his kingdom was divided up, they divided it up amongst a lot of, initially there was 27 provinces, and each province chose their own leader, and their own leaders then consolidated, and then these four families basically rose up. And why is that important? Well, it's important because to understand that there are in eschatological studies of the end times, there is a lot of disagreement on whether Daniel 8 is historic in nature in some respects or all futurist. Okay, is the vision that Daniel was given in chapter 8, has it already taken place, or will it take place in the future? And the answer is that it is both historic and future. And I'm going to next week spend the majority of the lesson from verses 9 through 14 to talk about it. But because here's the thing, what the complete futurists say is that in the end, leading up to the tribulation, that Iraq and Iran that Turkey, Greece, Turkey, and Iran are going to have another battle. Let me repeat that. What I believe that Daniel said is that, hey, Babylon is going to be conquered by the Medo-Persians. The Medo-Persians are going to be conquered by the Greeks. When Alexander the Great dies, his kingdom is going to be divided into four. And from there's going to come another horn, which we've already seen in chapter 7 and in Daniel chapter 2. There's going to come another power from that is going to be evil personified, or which we would call the Antichrist. What the futurists say, they're out there, there's a lot of popular writers, they say, yeah, we know that the Babylonians were conquered by the Medo-Persians, and the Medo-Persians were conquered by the Greeks, but Daniel chapter 8 says that in the future from our day to day, that Turkey/Greece, that Greek Empire is going to attack the Iran, and there's going to be a super contest, and from that the Antichrist will arise. Could it happen? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it could. I don't think that's what Daniel's saying though. So what I'm trying to do is give you two sides. Nobody disagrees about what they represent. What people do tend to disagree about is when it happens. Now, let me finish up by reading to you from verse 15, because there's some important things, and we're going to make more comments on Daniel chapter 8 later on in these latter verses. And it came to pass, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning of outcome. And so we've already said, he's been told things about things that are going to happen 200 years in the future. He doesn't know who the Javanites are. I don't know if that's what they're called. He doesn't understand how the Medo-Persians could conquer Babylon and the strength and the might that they, project. I saw from the behold, there stood before me as the appearance of man. This is an angel. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Uli, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. I like that. Yeah. Yay, Gabriel! One of the archangels. Michael, Gabriel, Lucifer, the three top dogs in the angel hierarchy. Lucifer has been kicked out of heaven. Michael and Gabriel are there, and we see Gabriel prominently in the New Testament when he announces the birth of Jesus, right? We see Michael later on in Daniel, and we see Michael in the book of Revelation when he goes in and he's doing some fighting and things like that, right? All right. And so he came near where I stood, and Gabriel comes near, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. Understandable. But he said unto me, understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Key word there, at the time of the end. Now, we'll focus in on verses 9 through 14, which is the end. This is what I think it's talking about there. And now as he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground. He fainted.
Oh, yeah.
He fainted. And he touched me and set me upon upright. And he said, Behold, I will make thee to know what shall be in the last end of the indignation. The indignation is important. You'll see that same concept over in earlier parts of the verses we will look at next week when we talk about the desolation. For at the time appointed the end shall be. Now, 3 times Gabriel says, I'm going to tell you what's going to be at the end. Because if you look at verses 20, the ram is the Medo-Persians. The rough goat is the king of Greek. The kingdom that is broken up, 4 stood up, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. I've already told you all things. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. That's when we get to the end. That's when we get to the end and we start talking about the Antichrist. I've told you in the past that in my understanding of scriptures, and again, I'm not dogmatic about it, but the 4th kingdom is the Islamic kingdom, right, which encompasses all this. The king of the north is what we're going to reference. What he's going to tell us is that the Antichrist is going to come out of this area right here. That's what he's going to. I'm just giving you the snapshot. Now he says some other things in the earlier verses, but as we get later on in Daniel, he says, but listen to what he says about the Antichrist. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. And he shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. I love it. He's going to rise to power, but not by his own power. Whose power do you think he will rise up with? Satan. Satan's going to give him the power. And we're going to see some things about Satan over in verses 9 through 14. But the Prince of Princes, who's the Prince of Princes? Jesus. Jesus he's going to rise up, but he, the Antichrist, will be broken without hand. We've already seen that, haven't we? Yeah. Jesus is going to destroy him with the word of his mouth. Mm-hmm. And the vision of the evening and the morning, which was told is true, wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. Gabriel says, okay, you've been given this vision, but you can't tell anybody. It's a secret.
Oh no.
It's a secret. And I, Daniel, fainted. And was 6 certain days. Can you imagine? Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. So a couple points. Daniel was told to shut the vision up. Revelation chapter 12 is going to say in the latter days, God's going to give people wisdom to tell the vision. He's going to reveal it to us. And that's the thing we have to understand. He is going to reveal it to us. What we have to do is be willing to listen to the leadership of His Spirit, and to listen and study the details of His Word. Again, I haven't said anything tonight that is probably not aligned with most modern theology. There are some variances. Next week might be a little different, because I'm going to challenge the idea. I'm going to challenge the idea that no man can know the day or the hour. Now, I am not going to set dates. I will not do that. Jesus said no man can know the day or the hour. Why did He say that? That's the challenge. Now, I'll give the snap preview is we have 2,300 days, which is a date certain. We have 1,290 days, which is a date certain. They start at this different point, they end on the same point. Okay? We'll look at it. So, write these verses down. Matthew chapter 24. I just want to make sure I get it right. I didn't write these in my notes. Verses 15 through, I don't know, let's just go down through 22. And then Revelation chapter 12. And these are going to be again, I'm going off my memory because I didn't write them in my notes, but I wanted to give you these verses to write down. Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 through 12. You can read all the way down through the end of the chapter, and we'll look at those. Also, I would encourage you to read a little bit ahead in Daniel chapter 11 and chapter 12. So there are some verses there. Identify the verses that talk about 1,290 days. By the way,